like the effective landing spot and how a prospect can develop versus like how we can project them to develop. And I think I was really interested by like our discussion about archetype and how like archetype by itself, I think that's the conclusion I arrived to. Archetype is, it may not be as valuable as if you incorporate thresholds like through like a statistical analysis. But I do think that overall, like using all of these like archetypal, like these roles and evaluating for the system and like building an overall board, I think those are all like very key components of scouting that like if we go back to the very first question, how do you explain scouting to like your mom? I think you have to account for all of these different schema within scouting to really provide like a holistic understanding of scouting itself.
Yeah. Well, you could give a simpler answer. Like, you don't have to give her a complete like explanation of what it
Yeah.
is. But yeah. But you're definitely right. Like, if you, it's really difficult to really explain, like, yeah, the full capacity of it without bringing up a bunch of things. So, would you say you're more like into fit now? It seems like you kind of changed your mind as far
Yeah.
as the value of fit a little bit.
Yeah. I think I actually just over the course of the episode just become a little bit more like into the idea of like fit aversion and just like how certain like skill sets can be. I think it's less, I used to approach fit more as like how you can how a fit can like accentuate a prospect, but I didn't really consider how like certain fits can like negatively affect the prospect, how they can like pigeonhole someone to like a role they aren't supposed to actually be in. So I think that accounting like the negative aspects of fit beyond the positive aspects of fit, I think if you're evaluating that and like how a team can like mess up a player's development, I don't think that's something I was really like considering in terms of like looking at busts or stuff like that. But yeah, I think I've become a little less developmental determinist over the course of this episode.
Yeah, definitely a bust. I think almost every bust, or like major bust, I guess. Well, yeah, you wouldn't really call second rounders bust. So every bust, I guess, is like a top pick almost. So yeah, they almost always have some like either injury or really bad fit. You could, for almost all of them, you could make like some pretty good excuse, quote unquote, for why
Exactly. Yeah.
they didn't work out. So like the framing of the episode and basically like it kind of like the way we talked about it kind of seemed like we're just discussing like random like philosophy stuff, and it was good and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But I think I wanted to make sure like people understand there's like the overarching topic is like first we discussed like scouting abroad and like different types of scouting, and then we kind of started to focus like on that we're going to focus on this podcast in general, like individual prospect evaluation. Like that's like the purpose of like, because this is a scouting podcast like about scouting philosophy in basketball, but it's not like the other types of scouting are not going to be as much our focus. And then we went into like what is value, what do we mean when we say like this prospect is better than another or worse than another, and or like this player probably is even more precise way to say it, because prospect kind of implies future like projection, which is what we're going to talk about today. But yeah, so we kind of we at least I try to like describe what value is and like what are the best ways to kind of define it quickly and in the most kind of general broad way, um, and what it means for another prospect to be better than another. So yeah, we kind of went into the various ways you could look at that in the last episode. So I just wanted to make
Yeah.
sure, so like maybe the listeners generally understand that that was like the big kind of theme, I guess, of the last episode. So yeah, now we're going into like the projection part, which is obviously like, because we're not just describing like the current value of the player, we're also trying to because this is like about often younger prospects and like draft prospects. So we're
Yeah.
trying to go into the projection part of it now. And then after this, I was thinking like what would be like the natural point to go into next, not this episode, but like in the future episode, this like now that we know what value is and what projection is
Mhm.
how and why are we using them in the ways that we do, and what ways can we use it better and so forth. But yeah, but in this episode we'll talk about projection. So yeah, do you have any initial thoughts on what I just said, or anything projection, anything you want to say?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues with projection that I see is that there's a fundamental difference between watching like scouting itself, you're just making observations on a player, right? And when you are making observations on the player, projection isn't always exactly intuitive. Like you can just say this player is good at this, not so good at this, and that oftentimes is like the extent of someone's evaluation. But I think projection is not necessarily intuitive, but it's very critical to like forming like an evaluation of a player. So you look at like each of the components of that player and trying to determine like how many of these are actually projectable. How can these like improve? Are there any like paths for like outlier development? Like there's so many different questions and like avenues through that we can evaluate through projection. So I think like I'm really excited to like dive into like how we can evaluate projection as a whole.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was listening to Evan Zamir. I think I sent you a link to the series he's doing.
Yeah.
It's called like the process, kind of a little bit similar to what we're doing, a little bit different also, but because he's going into more like particular examples of current prospects, whereas we are doing more like abstract, like philosophical type
Yeah.
of thing. But yeah, uh he was talking about how steals are such an important like indicator statistically, but they're not important defensively necessarily. They're just more important as a general indicator of like, you know, feel or whatever. We're not exactly sure like he called it like we don't know the exact causality, but we just know that they're important in general, not necessarily to project the player as a great defender if he has a lot of steals, but just to say that they're going to be good more likely in general. And yeah, I think that is that kind of what you meant, or did you have like another
Yeah,
example?
that's pretty similar to what I was saying. I think the other aspect of it is just like not understanding how like certain aspects of like statistical indicators, like which ones are actually meaningful, which ones are not. I think that's part of like the steal thing. And I think that's also a little part of like how you build your like philosophical like tendencies, right? Like if you are you trying to like make a claim and then trying to find like the sorts of evidence that fit your like your claim, or are you trying to like look for like a general like in Evan's case, like he consistently noticed that like steals were valuable, but he doesn't intuitively know like what is like why is this happening. So I think that that's honestly like a more robust way of like draft analysis, like finding trends and then trying to understand the trends rather than like simply like making claims and then like artificially trying to boost those up with like other evidences. But yeah, I think Evan did like a really good job in those little videos.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. No, yeah, that's interesting also because yeah, like there it is interesting to try to make that connection because like yeah, you could say that like steals are important, but and they predict somebody to be good, but to actually make the connection of why, that's really
Exactly.
difficult sometimes. It's
Yeah.
like you could be like good at projecting who's going to be good, but you may not know like the whys and what is it about them exactly that makes them good. And then the other thing I want to say is like yeah, I like the way I described it as like a statistical indicator, but of course you could also apply that in the eye test. Like say you're watching a player and they're really instinctive in the way they play the passing lanes or the way they pressure opponents defensively, and that
Yeah.
may seem like as a kind of a descriptive thing that they're being a very good player in the defensive end. But then you could also, when you're doing a projection, you may apply that overall to them as a prospect on both ends, not necessarily just them just their defensive projection. So yeah, you could
Yeah.
use the same kind of thinking in the eye test, not only statistics. But yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So I think yeah, like projection felt like the natural thing to go to next after
Mhm.
value for me because I think that's kind of like the two like major pillars. I kind of talked about it how we're going from like the bottom up from like the very basic stuff to going and going like spreading out into more like complex and kind of niche topics of scouting
Yeah.
philosophy. But you could also look at it from the opposite, like you're going from the very broad like descriptions of what describes like evaluation, prospect evaluation, which like the two major things is you're trying to determine a player's value and then project that value, and then kind of going bottom up. And I think I could share my screen, right? I'll try to share my screen. I want to show like that.
There's like a aspect of like feel that may not necessarily like it's not exactly like indicated here, but I think it does go into a little bit of like production and age that like if you are like feel can be quantified a little bit, and I think that does go into projection, but like if you're looking at the actual method of how they're generating defensive rotations rather than like statistically, like which I that's what I assume that you meant by production, like statistical production. Like if you look at the actual ways that they're creating advantages and generating defensive rotations and evaluate like how projectable that is specifically, I think that also can go into projections as well. But generally speaking, like
the components I'm sure are much
E-
different. Like we have
Exactly.
different things that we value, but yeah, I
Yeah.
just meant like on the overarching like
Yeah.
major way, like yeah, I feel like that's fairly
Just-
similar
Yeah.
for most people, but maybe that's why I wasn't sure. I haven't like asked a bunch of people about this stuff. Uh, but yeah, so let's go. What's it called? When we're projecting, generally what I see people do most often is talk about like ranges of outcomes. So like their ceiling, floor, and median outcome is like the most basic kind of way people talk about that. And I think I've always heard that even like when I was like a kid, like reading about the draft in like 1999, 2000 or something like
Yeah.
that. Even back then, they would have like these concepts of ceiling and floor and stuff like that. Yeah, would you do you also look at it that way? Do you find those useful? Should we maybe consider those more or less, or any thoughts on that?
I think that I see the value in that. Like trying to like create like a range of outcomes, like, oh, this is like 0th percent or not 0th, like 25th percentile outcome or 75th percentile outcome. So you're able to like create like a range of like meaningful projection almost. But like me personally, I don't think that, like, it kind of goes back into the idea of like developmental determinism that we were talking about before, like in the last episode. But I don't think like the range of outcomes is as severe as some people tend to make it out to be. And a lot of that is because I think that the framework of like 25th percentile, 50th percentile, 75th percentile, that's like, it seems mathematical, but at the end of the day, it's very like subjective, I think. And that if you I think that honing more in on like the 50th percentile outcome of what you actually think that player is going to become, I think that just holds more value. Like even if you like state their floor and ceiling, that seems subjective and somewhat like it doesn't hold as much value for me personally. I think that just evaluating them as a whole and just determining like how they will project to the league in general rather than setting it up in those percentile like format. That's like my personal stance, but obviously I'm still trying to figure it out. So where do you lie on that like stance?
Yeah, yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. Yeah, I think it's useful. I'm trying to think of maybe I would say that sometimes people overthink that and kind of
Yeah.
focus too much on like, oh, this guy's gonna have like a higher ceiling but a lower floor. Like I think we talked about some of this last time is that floor and ceiling are much more like like what is the word? Parallel to
Close.
each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, the higher your ceiling, the higher your floor in most cases. There are
Exactly.
some
Yeah.
places where it varies, but for most players it's going to be similar. So I think sometimes people like overthink that it's like one of those missing forest for the trace type of things where you're too worried about trying to think of all these different outcomes instead of just try to figure out the player first.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely like I think a theme for me in this podcast will be like trying to figure out like simple things that I think we haven't really gotten a good answer for, and a lot. It feels like a lot of the scouting community has moved on to making these really complex evaluations and descriptions and predictions of players, and kind of taking for granted the answers to these some of these more simpler and broad and general
Yeah.
questions that we haven't quite go. So yeah, as you see here, the value and projection are kind of like the two main pillars to trying to get to the final evaluation of any particular prospect, and then what goes into value and projection. And for value, I wrote production, and yeah, I think what people will think is like statistical production, but it doesn't necessarily have to be statistical production. It could be just like more general, like on court value. But definitely, you could add like different boxes. How I added in the projection part, a lot of boxes. I think they're
Yeah.
probably less in the value, but yeah, you could add like statistical. You could change the statistical production. You could change like current eye test evaluation or something like that. So you have like the value part of it is kind of like the descriptive, like the current what the prospect is like right now, and then the projection is kind of like the more kind of I guess vague or inexact parts of it that we're trying to like the
Yeah.
prediction fortune teller part of it, I guess. And I think the main thing for me is definitely age. So once you have the production and age, those two things on their own already, I think cover a lot of what we go to final evaluation. And I think those two things we've done a fairly good job. There's some really good statistical models, especially when you like the NBA guys, they have some great models. And age is what I love about age is obviously everybody has like an exact age, and it's very, very much like there's a ton of studies out there for anybody. I think most people that listen to this know this, but just in case some of the listeners may still have some questions, like age is, as far as like this type of stuff goes, how inexact everything is compared to it, age is like super valuable just because we have such a strong understanding that it correlates very much, like something like 85% or something like 80% of players reach their 2-year prime at like 26, 27, and then their 5-year prime between 23 or 24, I think, and 29, and the 10-year prime 23, 32. So you very consistently see the guys like rising of up to age, I don't know, 26, 27, and then a slow drop off into their 30s, and it gets quicker. So that having the age is extremely important because of how consistent it is. Like
Yeah.
everybody has a factual like age, and it's very correlative to their projection. And then after that, then you have things that are more like difficult to evaluate, like intel, like their personal stuff. That's an interesting topic in its own. And then like something like physical talent, like their tools, like how tall they are, um, how high they could jump, how fast they could run, and like their movement skills and stuff like that. So that, and then maybe there's other things that I'm not currently exactly thinking of, but I'm sure we could all, if we sat down and as we
Yeah.
do this podcast in the future, we'll think of other things that we would add here. But yeah, and so that all comes into the final kind of evaluation. So this is like kind of
Yeah.
my basic like understanding, like broad framework, quote unquote, for scouting players, but like figuring out like the more exact parts of this is kind of my purpose within this podcast. So yeah, sorry for this long rant.
Yeah. One question I had was for age, right? Is it more like exact age, or are there like exceptions? Like for example, we had like Pascal Siakam. He was pretty old, but he was a sophomore. So how do you treat that? Is it
Yeah,
exact
you're
or more
are you talking about
experience?
like age versus experience? Yeah, I think age is
Yeah,
far more important than experience. There is
really.
some like yeah, by far it's not even close. But there is some value that comes from experience, and depends on who you ask. I'm less kind of a proponent of experience in general, but some people that I think are worthy, like they have a, they're not just talking out of their ass, like they know what they're talking about, will tell you that like experience, I think none of them would say it matters as much as age, but would say that it's still like in certain examples at least it's quite important. Like if a player started playing organized basketball at like
Yeah,
age 16 or something, like certain examples
yeah,
like that, experience could come at least close to age or something like that, which I honestly I'd still disagree personally, but there's definitely arguments for it, and it's there's not conclusive evidence either way. We haven't had like a lot of studies. I don't think there's enough examples of that, to be honest,
yeah.
to
That's
really
true.
make a great fact finding type study on it. But yeah, I think but in most, like for the most top prospects, they've been playing basketball for quite a while, and the fact that one of them is a freshman and the other junior in college, if the junior is younger, I think the junior has a better age kind of score, even if even if the freshman hasn't had those 2 years of college experience yet, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I'm a little less age focused. I think that uh, like the stuff you said about not playing basketball early, like Joel Embiid's like a really good example of that. Like he had all of these, he was like very young, very productive, but like on top of that, like he started playing basketball when he was like 15. So like if you like take that, and I think taking that into effect is actually very important. Like that skill development curve, like going from 15 to like 18 and going from like never playing basketball to being like an all-American or like top three pick. I think that valuing that more, so valuing him more relative to other people his age, I think that is like pretty important. Or like Chris Boucher, Pascal Siakam, those are all like guys who were drafted relatively late but didn't have like the same level of experience.
Yeah.
So I think that guys who didn't play basketball as much growing up, or maybe like they experienced like a growth spurt or something, like Trey Murphy, like he was like 6'1" when he started college and then he became like 6'9", like stuff like that. I think taking into consideration like how they've developed is also important. So it's like kind of like a corollary to like specifically like age specific stuff. But generally speaking, I do agree with you. Like age is probably the prime like factor that you look to consider like how projection evolves.
Well, what's it called? Yeah, the Trey Murphy example is like more like physical talent, I would say, in my case. But
Yeah.
yeah, you could maybe do like a separate category where you would talk about um like guys specifically, like you said, that are in like the middle of a growth spurt and like adjusting to their new physical stature or whatever. But as far as experience, I have done personal like study where I compared players by age versus
Mhm.
experience, and like their age, the age related like graph was all like very, straight, and the experience one was like all over the place. And the only what like correlations you found with how they developed is because guys generally start at the same age. So it was like basically just, yeah, it showed the same thing that like, yeah, most guys enter the NBA at 21 or 22, and yeah, they slowly get better and improve and then slowly get worse. And it's which is along the age curve. But like the year
Exactly.
they
Yeah.
left, like if they left at 20 or 21 or 22 and they got more experience or less experience, how many years of experience they played NBA had almost no correlation with like their like, career arc, like the arc of improvement and decline. So yeah, there's not a lot of, but yeah, as far as like the guys that didn't have a lot of experience that started playing
Yeah.
basketball, organized basketball, we could definitely talk about that more in the future. But I would say,
Mhm.
in my opinion, I think there's a lot of like survivor bias in that, because there's definitely examples of guys that like started playing basketball late at like 16 and whatever, and then they kind of just always sucked and didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Because we remember like the Embiids and the Siakams, but I'm sure we could find quite a few examples of guys that didn't have this, crazy, improvement arc. And to be clear, obviously, I'm not saying that everybody has exactly the same,
Yeah.
career
Yeah.
arc. Everybody improves exactly 0.05 of value over replacement every year until 24, and then they improve exactly point. Obviously, it's all over the place. Guys get worse sometimes, even as when they're younger, and then they'll get back up. That's another interesting topic where guys sometimes, if a younger guy stagnates for a year, that doesn't mean that they're now stagnating. If they're still like 20, 21, they're likely going to get back on that career arc, even if they stagnate for a year in a lot of cases,
Do you
is
have
what
any
I've found.
examples of those players?
Sure, yeah, like Jimmy Butler, Chris
Oh
Middleton, they
yeah,
ha-
yeah.
they
Chris
they played
Middleton's
worse
good.
in
Yeah.
their senior year than their junior year, and
Yeah.
in college. Yeah, like guys like that. There's quite a few. Evan Mobley had a kind of poor high school senior year and stagnated, quote unquote. So yeah, that even in those examples, the age kind of overrides the not experience, but like their kind of improvement arc, age. So I think age is very, very important in as
Yeah.
far as in the projection part. But there's definitely
I think first, like establishing like a value as like some sort of like instantaneous measure almost. Like projection is the future, value is now. I think that I don't know if that's exactly how you meant to project, like how to set this up, but
yeah,
that's kind of how I interpret it. Like the value is not necessarily like statistical production, but also like the current skills and attributes of that player at the moment. And then
right.
projection is like taking like the conglomeration of all that projection and like trying to project almost like how much of these like which of these is projectable, which of these can actually be functional in the league, and which of these not necessarily like just essentially like a role-based analysis is what projection is rather than looking at the instantaneous value. But I just want to see if that's the same.
What you're saying about the value and projection, I think that's interesting. You're right that like value is like a current, and then projection is for the
Yeah.
future. But value doesn't have to be current, as in what they're doing right now for their college team. It's more like, again, I'm going to when I'm talking about value, I'm talking about like the truth, like the philosophical truth, like so what they really are. And even if I'm not, obviously, I'm not going to be able to actually. I'm a human being. I'm not a god.
Yeah.
So like I can't actually like figure out what that exactly is, but I'm trying to get as close as possible to figuring out like what is their value currently. And then the projection is everything else, like that goes into figuring out what their value will be in, I don't know, 5 years or whatever. We could talk about, that's another aspect of it, is how many years, when are we talking about for a period of time, are we talking about for a certain period in time, and so forth. But
Like so many of these role players had such a high usage in college. Like if you look at like all like David Roddy had like a what, like 29% usage right this year. Like that's not projectable. Like he's not going to do that in the NBA. So like having like the foresight to distinguish between a current player's like a role right now versus like their role as like perhaps they're going to be a role player. And obviously there's a lot of like inexact science in that. Like you can't exactly pigeonhole someone to being a role player in the NBA or like exactly know like the star equity of that player. But I do think that like evaluating how good of a player is within their college role and seeing like the micro skills that they're actually good at, which can be projectable into like a future role, that is more important than simply like evaluating how good they are in a role at the moment. So I think it is a little more projection, but yeah.
yeah, but it's not about how good they're in a role. I agree with you, almost everything, but just it's not how good they're in a role currently, but it's how that role affects their
Yeah, yeah. How they
true
function.
value,
Yeah.
which you want to project. Or corollary property of projection is, like, I would say, age, and some would argue experience, but I would definitely, I think, in
Yeah.
fact, I'll even say, yeah, like the mathematical data. Again, I talked about this, like I made a study. It's like, yeah, sure, yeah, we could argue about in the future, like about like certain prospects that started really late. Maybe there's some proof for those guys that experience is even just as important. But for, I don't know, 90-80% of guys, age is going to be like the main pretty much thing. But then besides that, like what other aspects do we have that could kind of go into projection? And then even like intel, do we also think that's just we should define intel also. When I say
Yeah.
intel,
What is intel?
in this context, like of scouting, we don't mean necessarily uh like stuff that's on court. We're talking about mostly like off court, like their personality, their like how they are in the locker room. Do they have like some kind of emotional or personal dark issues, or maybe they're a great personality. Like, I don't want to be all negative, So yeah, just like things like that. Intel in the scouting kind of lingo is just referring to like off court things, like personal and things like that. Just how do you think that goes into, is purely projection? I guess intel is partly part of value currently also, right? Because the way the player is right now,
Yeah.
like off court and stuff like that, yeah, that could influence their current value. But yeah, do you have any thoughts on intel, and do you think what other aspects could we add to projection?
I think Intel could also, I think it does have like a largely innately like production aspect of it. Like a player's wiring is not going to significantly change going from like college to NBA. And like a part of like Intel might be like their work ethic or like maybe something that we can actually like understand as motor. Like for example, like Russell Westbrook had like a very like high motor. Like his transition frequency was like pretty insane, if I recall correctly. So there is like an aspect of production that we can like link to Intel through like a motor. But I do think that there is so much about Intel that we just don't know. So like I need like a significant like database or like just some more data to effectively evaluate like how effective Intel is towards projecting versus simply like their like instantaneous value. But yeah, I think Intel is more just because like the framework, the wiring doesn't change too much. I think I would almost argue that it is like more so production than projection. But I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I just think that because Intel is more about how they're gonna be in the future, I kind of view it more as, for projection. I do agree it's partly like current production is definitely influenced by like off court. Even like think about it this way: like a guy that's a great team leader in the locker room could influence the team to be better, which is part of their current value to the
Yeah.
team that they're on, right? So in that way, yeah, Intel could.
So
I
would you say that like stuff like this like drastically changes over time? Like if a player like there's a player who didn't have off court issues like end up having off court issues largely, or like did they mainly have off court issues both before college and or like during college and like in the NBA? Like how does Intel how is it like my question is how much does it change so much that it becomes projection rather than like the instantaneous value?
Well, you got to realize these guys are like 19, 20. Like people change a
Oh
lot.
yeah,
I was a complete dumbass when I was like 20, like I was a total idiot. So what's it called? I've changed a lot, but yes, of course, you can't predict that. Like, and the value, I mean, the kind of understanding of their quote unquote intel we have is what they are right now. And obviously, like having quote unquote bad negative intel right now is correlative with being negative in the future. And but still, yeah, you could make some in the, it's obviously also with everything, with anything we talk about here, it's always, we can make broad generalizations, but also at the end of the day, it's going to go down by individual case. Like Intel period, what's it called? How important is it? There's not like any like, because I'm big again on always questioning anything, and
yeah,
like in scouting community, like Intel very like people speak of it very highly, and even some scouts, honestly, I'm kind of skeptical of this, but some scouts say that Intel is more important than on-court performance, or just as important as
yeah,
on-court performance. And I don't believe there's
yeah,
any
same.
scout out there that actually believes that. Like they say that, but they don't actually freaking value players like that. That's bullshit. But I mean, it definitely has some. I think it does have some importance, but how much? And what exactly constitutes intel that's a positive indicator and intel that's a negative indicator, and like what things we should be like looking at and trying to figure out about players' personality, what things are important and what things are less important. Obviously there's like things that you could go into like moral, like if somebody's like, not to say names, but like somebody has like doing like sexual abuse or something from like a moral standpoint.
Yeah, yeah,
We could have a negative outlook on them, but um, outside of stuff like that, like just from a purely projection of them as a basketball player in future, their final evaluation of their future value. Yeah, what type of intel is effective and what isn't, and to what extent? This stuff is all very much, I think, undecided, and it's really difficult to evaluate because, we don't have access to that for obvious reasons, and teams aren't super like excited to share that stuff also, and obviously players are human beings and we can't just expose all their business out there and stuff, so it's very very difficult and imprecise dealing with this stuff. And I think sometimes people like it's important. I don't want to like say that we should completely throw it away,
yeah.
and but I do think that sometimes people over like emphasize it and stuff like that.
No, I agree with you. I think that the issue with like Intel, specifically about like their personality or stuff like that, like obviously like the other stuff, like especially like sexual abuse or something, like you can pretty easily make in a like evaluation on someone just based off like if they have like that significant like off-core issues. But like specifically about Intel, about like their personality and stuff like that, like so much of it is so untestable. Like if you just say, oh, this guy has such an infectious personality, like Scotty Barnes had a really good personality, and maybe like you can say, oh, that contributed to him being rookie of the year somehow. But like it's really hard to make connections based off just like intel like that, even if they are so like infectious, like such an infectious personality, always smiling, everyone likes them. Like I think that maybe it does have some sort of value, and maybe it is like us as like armchair scouts, where like we don't exactly have that type of knowledge, we don't have intel at all, so we can't really make like over like those like constructivist like claims like over and over again. We can see like these specific like personalities succeeding, so then we can make that claim that, oh, this type of personality has a higher rate of success. So maybe it is like us, like our perspective, but just like in general, I am a little bit skeptical of intel and just its importance, like on ball performance versus intel. It's like not a question at all. It's obviously on ball performance for me, but like just generally speaking, I think that the issue that there are very like significant issues with intel that like unless we're like actually receiving the intel, watching the intel, like sending out the intel, there are like some fundamental issues with it.
Yeah, I found that what's it called? Often as I've kind of gained a little bit like I'm not like Mark Stein or what's his name, Woj or anything, but as I've gotten
Yeah,
to know at least a few people behind the scenes in the NBA, I definitely have found like bit of a pattern of like players that the draft Twitter is higher on or lower on. Often the reason the NBA is higher or lower on them is because they either have some negative or really positive info about them. So yeah, but it's definitely difficult to say how much value that has. But
Yeah.
I will say, like I remember watching like Fox in a pre-draft workout before the draft, and you could
Hmm.
tell like just among his players, like among the players, he was like there was a couple guys like Jonathan Motley from Baylor. I don't know if you remember him.
Yeah,
Matt
yeah.
Jones who played on Duke. Like there was a couple other like D1 high major guys there, but he clearly stood out as the leader, not because necessarily even of a skill or anything, but just like of his personality and how he was interacting with everybody. He was like the center of attention, and I think that kind of like charisma persona kind of definitely has some like positive connotation and like is a positive indicator to some degree, but it's definitely difficult to even evaluate it that in the first place. And even if you do and you're somewhat successful at figuring out who has that and who doesn't, it's like how much value that has. Yeah, you definitely have to be careful with
I
that.
think like one of the issues with that is like Darren Fox was the leader, and he's also like this like the lead guard of the Kings. So like what happens to a prospect who was like the leader of their team? They had high usage, like they were like fundamentally like, leading the team, but then when they're like in the league, they're not the leaders, they're the role player, they're like coming off the bench. And how does that like even if you have the intel, like not only do we is like that the concept of intel nebulous in and of itself, like how are we evaluating the intel, but even like projecting intel itself. So if a player isn't a leader but they are a leader on the college team, how is the personality going to fit in on that team if they're not carrying such a high usage or such a role, if they're not like important on that team? So I think that like simply
Yeah.
projecting intel is already like so difficult, so that like, and we don't even know the value of intel, like that's what we're debating right now. So just overall, I think intel is just such a, like a nebulous concept that unless you're like really working in the league, really like understanding and seeing these patterns, it's just really hard to like figure out. And that's part of the struggle with this.
Well, I'll just say real quick, just to clarify a little bit. I do like, well, I was talking about is more like it's not even necessarily like leadership, as in
Uh-huh.
like basketball wise, but more like a certain like charisma and like a quote unquote star power. And I think that does like help players to some degree as far as like dealing with the pressure and kind of the tension that
Yeah.
comes with being an NBA player and that sort of thing. I think there is some sense of that and some value in having that type of like personality. It doesn't mean like you're like bombastic or have like you're super outgoing necessarily, but just having that some kind of like star power and ability to deal with pressures and so forth. I think there is yeah, like some value of that in that, but
Yeah.
that doesn't necessarily come out as being like a on-court leader or being a vocal leader or somebody who people like listen to on the floor per se, even though I'm sure there's probably some correlation with that as well, but yeah, I just meant more in a broad sense, and yeah, that type of
There's
thing.
probably like some survivor bias in that too. Like if a player does have that charisma and like as they're like a natural leader and they're like able to withstand pressure, it's probably because they're good enough to withstand pressure. They have like that requisite like skill threshold so that they're not worried about all that pressure. But I do see like the value of these type of players, like Fox type like leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember like I saw PG Washington at the AU tournament. He just had like a glow to him. Like this guy, like this was he was I think senior. He had just finished his senior year in high school before Kentucky, and what's it called? Yeah, he had just like a like a charisma to him. Like I didn't even see his face. I didn't know it was PG Washington at first, but I just saw him like, oh, that guy must be like one of the top like prospects. So like he just had like a feel to him. So yeah. I think that has like that always stuck out in my mind along with that Fox seeing Fox work out in that pre-draft, like how these guys have some of these guys always have certain like again, like the best way I could put it is like a charisma to them. Another one is interesting is like off-court intelligence, and that's one I've talked to sort of like half an episode on intel in the future, but I don't know if
Yeah.
we're gonna cover too much of it. Again, we're not experts on intel, and that's not really like our expertise in this, so we
Yeah.
could talk
Yeah.
about it here. Yeah, just like as far as off-court intelligence, what's it called? How much value does that have? Because I don't think off-court intelligence is particularly correlated. Maybe there's some minor like parallel between that and like on court quote unquote feel or basketball IQ or whatever you want to call it. But I don't think there's like a big correlation between those two
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
But at the same time, I do think off-court intelligence could be useful. Just as an example, for example, how well do you plan out your day, and that you could fit in more hours for training and practicing, in the off season or something like that. Somebody who has a higher off-court intelligence may be better at figuring out how to get more hours of practice in, where somebody who's kind of unorganized all over the place. I guess that's more to do with being organized, but I would say intelligence and organization have some parallel to them. Some
yeah. I think
correlation.
like self-motivation, like work ethic, like I think that's more along those lines and just simply like off court like intelligence. Like I remember during the 2020 cycle, like Tyrell Terry scored like the highest on that on one of those like knowledge exams or something. Like obviously that didn't pan out the way it did, but yeah, I don't think like all these like off court intelligence scores really like has that much value. It needs to be functional. And like I remember I watched like one of those like ESPN like sports science episodes about like John Wall, and like he was able to like pass a ball like very accurately without like looking at it. It was like something weird like that. But just I don't know if that's exactly intelligence, but it's like it's like outlier hand-eye coordination and just like the ability to like self-organize yourself and like control like other aspects of your body without having like exact control over like what you're doing at that moment in time. So I don't know if that's intelligence, but just outlier like I don't know, body control, outlier just
Oh yeah.
awareness. Yeah, I don't know what that is, but if you're talking purely from like a off court intelligence like IQ stuff, like no, I don't see any value in that.
I think there's some. It's just very minor, and I definitely
Yeah,
agree
yeah,
that like having like Terrell Terry score really high on the test. I don't think that
yeah. I don't
makes
think you move them
a
up on your board because of
serious
that.
difference. Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, you're right. Like at the end of the day, it doesn't really like move the needle. But I guess there's like I would say there is some minor like things that you could come up with that would like
Yeah.
allow a person to be with better off court intelligence to be more effective. Yeah, sorry.
I think it's more like personality based. I don't like. I guess work ethic is like an aspect of it, but
That's a good question.
shit. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I was just because you said personality based. I was like thinking like personality tests, and then I thought like like, do you think there's any like tests or like any way? Like I talked about, it's really difficult to do studies on
Uh,
Intel because like it has personal stuff
yeah, exactly.
and stuff yeah, teams are not going to be willing to share, and players obviously are not going to be willing to share. So yeah, do you have any ideas how we could put a more like precise or like quote unquote mathematical scientific method to gathering and evaluating the value of intel?
I think like designating the types of intel and like just evaluating like whether like how translatable each of these types of intel is. Like if you sort it by like personality or like what types of personalities are like the most like translatable, or you doing like work ethic or stuff like that. Like I can't exactly think of like all these different types of classifications, but like generally speaking, that like I think work ethic does hold like some value. And the thing with work ethic is that you can like see the production like the parallel like on the court, right? But like in terms of motor or something like that. But I do think that like in my limited experience, I do think that like work ethic, like there's been numerous studies about like grit. I think that generally speaking, that does have some sort of value that you can attribute to maybe like the underlying causes of outlier development. But yeah.
What you said, numerous studies on grit. Can you expand on
Yeah,
that?
like grit. Like there's like a book by like Angela Duckworth like called like Grit, and this is like outside the scope. This is like general psychology,
Yeah,
but
yeah, and I want to
yeah,
say something about that, but go on, sorry.
yeah, like essentially like for grit, like I don't remember like the exact context of where like the book was written, but essentially like people who have that sort of like grit, who have that sort of like underlying motivation that's much more like outlier relative like to their peers, they tend to have better outcomes overall. So that's like a very reductive way of like summarizing the entire book,
Right,
but
right.
generally like these players who have such high work ethics, they just see so much more like success relative to their peers who may not like maybe they're still hard workers, but they're not like these outlier work ethics. So I do think that like work ethic and outlier development, those are like two like pairs that can be explored more, but
generally speaking, like grit outlier, like grit, working hard, like all this stuff, I think it does have value, and it is separate from like more of the personality evaluations.
Yeah, this feels like you said, this is like the outside the scope of scouting, unless like you expect
Yeah.
scouts to start getting like psychology PhDs or whatever. I think teams should be hiring psychologists to administer these types
No,
of
yeah,
like
I agree with that.
high. Yeah, no, I know, but I'm just saying
Yeah.
like high what is it called? Not difficulty, but like basically they need a high level of expertise, these types of tests and questions and personal evaluation. So yeah, I think if I was a team, I'd probably hire a psychologist who's like an expert on like personality types and this types of those types of things, to kind of figure out these parts of the evaluation, and then have them work in tandem with the scouts. And for us, it's like doing it for the perspective of the scouts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's not really our not even not our place, but not really just our like expertise, our thing to really
Yeah.
focus on.
Would you say that like personality or like relative level of work ethic correlates to like the role of someone? Like if someone doesn't have like not important, but like as like high usage of a role as someone else, does their like work ethic or personality tend to be different from someone who's like more of like a star equity type player, or is it more like standardized or just equal along all playing fields?
I think it's mostly standardized, but there's probably some minor like excuse me, um what is it called, traits, the
Yeah.
personal traits that certain types of players have. But like as a broad, I think it's pretty standardized as far as just like it could be all types of different personality types, but they just have a tendency to do X. I don't know. Yeah, well, maybe notice small details or something like that. They have, something like that. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I generally think that it's pretty even along, but although like there are so many different forms of personalities, like LeBron is such like a like he's a very high motivating leader. When you have like Kawhi, who's just like
That's what I
Kawhi,
mean.
like
Yeah.
obviously like that's very reductive again, but just like personalities differ so much that you can't really create some sort of like correlatory like to role where like certain players like, oh, if you have a lower role, like your personality is different. So I think that's another issue with like
Was I
Intel itself.
misusing? That's what I was saying. Maybe I misused the
Yeah,
word
no,
standardized. No, no,
no, I think you said it correctly, but I just think that like I wish that it kind of was correlated to role in a way. Like that would make it easier to project. But just like this is just another factor of like projection within Intel, specifically personality Intel. Like there's so many different ways, like there's so much like avenues that like this personality could hold within like the the structure of like a team that it's just really hard for me to like see Intel as like a truly projectable thing.
Another interesting
Yeah.
thing is how do different personalities mesh together, and like on a chemistry
Yeah.
level, how players maybe interact on a personal level, and how that could lead to better on-court outcomes for a team. That's another interesting thing to look at. And then even like I've tried to when a while back, I had a little study for astrology. I tried to run like
Oh,
different like
really?
signs and how they players mesh together, but it turned out
Yeah,
like I
yeah,
don't believe in astrology, but
yeah,
like
yeah,
fuck it, might as well try it. But yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I just like I said, I'm always open. Like you should ask every question and try everything. Never just like dismiss anything outright. A little bit for context, what's it called? As far as how fit could change your projection. What's
yeah.
interesting is in the sense of projection is like future fit. So like the NBA's at least in the past, some would argue that now less so because like it's been already so much change, but uh, who knows? We'll see what happens in the future. But at least in the past, like even like 5, 10 years, when we look back, the NBA is so
Uh-huh.
different. Like teams have shot. Obviously, the biggest thing is the three-pointer revolution. But even like
Yeah,
the addition of mobility, then certain types of like smaller point guards are no longer as viable. Slower bigs or like back to the basket bigs for the most part have been obsolete outside maybe like a few like superstars. So like
yeah,
all these changes. So that's an interesting part of projection, like how how do you value that? Do you think about that at all, or do you just kind of throw it up to it's too much uncertainty to even really focus on that?
So is that more like an indictment on archetypes, or could you
Uh,
like elaborate on that?
yeah, it could be archetypes, but I mean archetypes because archetypes is kind of like the player because like where's
Yeah. I meant
yeah, so
like mobility, like slower bigs or like stuff like that.
yeah, just
That's
the
more archetype.
NBA as a whole, like how the play style within the league is changing, and
Yeah.
because you're projecting the player to the future, like say what's gonna happen 5 years from now or something. How because like say
Oh
you're
yes, I
drafting a
see, I see.
19,
Yeah.
you see what I'm saying? Like you're drafting a
Yeah,
19
okay.
year old and you're trying to figure out how good they'll be when they're 25. But say right now they're good because like they would fit well. If they're instantly 25 tomorrow, like their 25-year-old self would fit well in the league as it is right now. But maybe as the league will be in 5, 6 years, their archetype or their skill set in whatever way may be made obsolete to at least to some degree.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. I think that like I don't know if the 3-point revolution was exactly like it's a kind of like hindsight bias too, but was it that crazy? Like if we can like plot out like different types of market inefficiencies within like how everyone's like interacting on the court right now, and then trying to project like what are those market inefficiencies that are going to be like exploited, and then try to target players who like fit that bill of market inefficiency. I think that is like a reasonable way of project of like going about projection. But then the other issue with that is like maybe it is hindsight bias. It's so difficult to like understand what's going to be valuable in 5 to 6 years. Like the other side of the coin is like, why even try to do that and just focus on the skill and like how that player like functions right now in today's NBA, rather than simply like just trying to project like not only are you projecting the player, now you're projecting like the NBA itself, how teams are gonna like interact. So there's so much projection that maybe it's not like a very valuable value proposition at all. But
Yeah,
I
I think
mean,
I mostly agree with that. I would say, like, think about, I don't know how much you remember this, but like in 2003, somebody who's like a back to the basket big, like a large, like 7 foot, 275 pound guy could be really valuable because back then there was a lot less like help defense. You weren't really allowed to help on
no,
guys
yeah.
when they didn't have the ball in their hands. You couldn't really double guys. So, having somebody who could really dominate in a one-on-one situation and get like relatively decent shots, could be really valuable. But if you draft a 19-year-old who you project to be that by 2009, like when they're already 25, that was already made almost obsolete. Like guys like that were far, far less valuable. I'm thinking like Emeka Okafor is probably a decent example of a guy like that who was, I think, like some of his best years were like him as a rookie and like his second year
Uh,
because the NBA kind of, but I mean, he had other skills, so that's not a perfect example. But I'm sure we could think of guys like that, and or like even
like
more
Shangun
recently.
maybe. Shangun, like Alperen
Oh yeah,
Shangun.
yeah.
Yeah.
What about him?
Like
What do
he
you
was
mean?
similar, like I think the same issues were with him. Like he was like the controversy was like he was so productive in the Adriatic League, but like at the same time his like go-to move was like a post up, which is like considered like one of the most inefficient moves nowadays. So like that
Yeah, yeah,
debate
but
as
now
well.
we know that. But I'm talking about
Yeah.
back when we didn't know that, like in
Yeah.
'03, and
No, yeah, that
it's
makes
not we
sense.
did it, even we didn't know that. It's that we knew that it was good back then in the
Yeah, yeah.
NBA. But then like 6 years later, by the time he matured, it was already not good. It was already much less valuable. Or like Okafor is another example. It's like where that I think his failure as an NBA player, unfortunately, it's kind of changed a lot in the league where people really kind of became really like hard line no to like slower, less mobile or skilled big men. Whereas before him, guys like that still held some value.
No, yeah. I think it is hard to project, but like if you like you get guys like Amika or Okafor who are like now that their skill set is somewhat like extinct, like their best seasons at the beginning of the career rather than the end. I think that's like really interesting, but I just don't know like how much of this like concept can play in a projection. Like how much can we really like expect like
Yeah, like
how could
anticipate
people
that.
yeah, I don't know how it, and because it's so hard to anticipate, like how valuable is it to even try to anticipate it if we're already trying to we don't even know how this player is going to project to the league. Now we have to project like all of this, the change in the NBA play style. I don't know, like just generally how valuable that is. But I do see like I do think like the 3 point revolution or whatever people call it, like that wasn't crazy. Like even though the post up was so
I don't
like
know. The
yeah,
NBA, like the average team from 3-point shooting, like the amount of their total field goal
oh
attempts
yeah,
that
yeah,
were 3-point attempts, like I don't know, 6 years ago even, or 5 years ago, that team would be like not even 30th
oh yeah,
this year. Like for the last like six, even I don't know exactly how many, but a bunch of seasons, like every year, the amount of like frequency of 3-point attempts has gone up across the league every single season. It's like steadily climbing. And I mean, I guess the rebuttal would be like that doesn't really change anything, because like from a drafting perspective, like because you would want 3-point shooters even back then, like 6-7 years ago, if you drafted somebody who was a good 3-point shooter. Like I don't know if there's like a type of player, like an archetype, like you said, that would really be far less or far more valuable now than they were back then. And maybe like some certain types of like guys that are really high volume 3-point shooters, like a Duncan Robinson, or like some of those Miami, like Struss or somebody like that,
yeah,
probably wouldn't be able to find a niche in the league as easily back then. But I think they
yeah.
would
I
still
agree with
be
that.
a decent pickup for where they were, because they were like undrafted guys. So even back then, they probably would have been a pretty decent pickup.
But like, was the 3 pointer not a clear market inefficiency? Like there's literally
Right.
a line on the court, like like it counts 3 point. It's 3 points, 50% more than like the 2 points. But I don't know. I feel like it's somewhat sort of intuitive that eventually there would be players who would be good enough to command closeouts that far, like which would like absolutely screw everything else up on the court. But I don't know. Like it seems kind
That's
of
a good
obvious.
point.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
that's
I
fair.
think
That's fair. You could say like there's nothing that obvious that stands out right now, you're saying?
maybe like free throws, kind of like the like foul drawing and like getting to the free throw line so much that kind of seemed like another. Obviously, there's also kind of hindsight bias, of course, but there's literally a line on the court where someone gets a free like 2 buckets or something, there's 2 shots or something like that. So maybe like trying to farm shots from there as much as you can would be like an intuitive evolution within that 3 point era. But I don't know, so much hindsight bias, but
I think
I
there's
would,
two things
yeah,
that I've seen though that people are kind of predicting. The first one is more like common, it's not as underground, is like just teams continuing to consolidate size into like playing 5, 6, 7, 6, 8 guys, like having small centers and tall point guards, and just everybody switch everything, and
yeah,
more mobility. Because we see, I think it's been damn near proven that obviously there's limits, but in general, speed beats size in basketball, like
yeah,
in broad. Obviously, again, you can't like play me and you versus Jokic and Embiid. We're not going to win just because we're smaller or whatever. Well, I guess that would we're probably not even faster than them either. But like, you know what I mean?
yeah.
Like some I don't know, some fast small guys are not just going to beat two slower big guys just because. But in general, if all things more or less equal, speed beats size in basketball. So yeah, from that perspective, like if you could get guys that are taller and also quick, which usually
Yeah,
is about 6'5", 6'6", where you could kind of get a good
yeah, exactly.
equilibrium. Yeah. So yeah, uh, that's the first one, and then the second one I've seen is like it's not as popular, but some people believe this could be like the next big thing, because there's like this offense that's been like sweeping like D3 and NAIA, where Henry Ward used to talk about a lot of this. If you guys, I don't know if his articles are still up, because I know he got hired by a team, so
Yeah, I
I
don't
don't know
think
if
they are.
Oh, well, he had some good,
Yeah,
but I've seen some other people talk about it. I'll try to find it when I put the episode out. I'll try to find there's a video on it on YouTube if it's still there, not by him, somebody else, and I'll put it in like the description or something. But yeah, there's this like really offense that's been really effective at lower levels, where there's a lot of movement and quick passing, and it's kind of like a special type of motion offense where they're constantly like catching the ball in the right of way, driving and making certain types of cuts that make it really difficult to
Okay.
close out
Yeah.
and kind of recover and stay in front on defense and allow for a lot of good looks. And so some people think that in the future, teams will start to adopt a lot of those principles, and slowly the NBA will kind of move to using that type of offensive scheme. So looking at players like Scotty Barnes is a decent example of a guy like that that could be a lot more valuable within that, because he's tall and he's such a great passer, and he could move off ball, and he's long and pretty athletic in certain ways. So or guys like, I don't know, like a Tyrese Halliburton or Alonzo Ball, who could make quick decisions moving the ball and hit spot ups at a relatively high rate. So some people believe like valuing like that guys like that higher uh uh is the way to go if you're like
Yeah.
trying to project.
I think like more like it's along those lines, but like oversized ball handlers, like guys who are like 6'8", 6'9", who can like really create advantages. That's like an archetype almost that like that's kind of like swept up from less like LaMelo Ball, Josh Giddey, like even like LeBron, whatever, like Ben Simmons, like all these guys who are like able to handle the ball at this height. Like it inherently like creates like stress within the defense because you have like this guy playing the one, but he's also like 6'10". So I think Scotty Barnes falls into that. Franz Wagner falls into that. But essentially, like ultimately, like the end of the day, basketball is just like efficient movements, right? Like you're trying to cover the most amount of space, both vertically and horizontally, and also like whatever the third dimension is, up and down. But like if you're like so big that you're able to take up so much of the court with those like long movements, but you're also able to create advantages and like capitalize upon those advantages. Like so if you're 6'10", you can move across the court, you're very fluid, and at the same time you can create those advantages with your like physicality or whatever, and you can also capitalize upon those advantages that you're creating by through your passing. That's kind of like that's like I don't think you can really go beyond that almost. You have a 7'1" guy like or 7'4" guy like Vic, who can like do all like theoretically do all of these things. That's like like people might see that that's like the peak of basketball almost. That's like the archetype that you can't really beat. But at the like the flip end of that coin is that like there's still I don't know, like there's still so much evolution going on that you still really can't predict. Even if like the dream archetype right now that we're like projecting in 2022 may not be the dream archetype we see in like 2030. So there's still so much projection within like how basketball will evolve that I'm not confident in saying like this is the player that we want to see in the future. But I still do think that like because basketball is all about like efficient movements, that players who can cover the most ground and also capitalize upon advantages, I'm fairly confident in saying like that is the next legion of players who will come to dominate the league. But I don't know how much value that has in projection.
Well, I will say that the one thing I look at, I don't know if I should save this for more. Well, we could talk about it now, whatever. Is like guys that are like in that 6'7", 6'8", 6'9" range that could
Yeah.
potentially be primary offensive options are really valuable. The reason for that though is because at the point guard position, generally that's where guys have a lot of offensive value in general. So like the average offensive value for a point guard is fairly high relative to like other positions, whereas the average offensive
Yeah.
value for somebody who fills the 3 or the 4 is on average lower. So having somebody who could create a high offensive value
Oh
from the 3
yeah.
or the 4 gives you a really high value over a replacement player or like the average player, which is why a lot of teams that are very successful and like contenders often have players at those positions that are like kind of the drivers of the offense, like LeBron or Kevin Durant or Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and so forth. So that's why I was kind of higher. Part of the reason I was higher on this year's draft, like Banchero and Jabari Smith, and even like an AG Griffin, is even though guys like that are unlikely to ever be superstar players and like really like
Yeah.
primaries on a contending team, the little chance they do have of that at their kind of archetype, I think makes them that much more valuable.
Wait, could you elaborate on that point a little bit about the 2022 draft? Like what
Well,
about their
because
archetype makes them more valuable?
I just explained because they are like 6'9", 6'10".
Oh, like the skill
Are
thresholds get considering like their height.
On the offensive end, if you could
Yeah.
provide a lot of value in that in those positions, as a tall wing or as a kind of ball perimeter foreman, like a combo forward offensive player, if you can provide a lot really high offensive value from that archetype position, whatever you want to call it, it has more value over the average player at that position than it does as a point guard, as a guy who plays the one. And I say that as on the defensive end, who guards ones, because you still need a guy who guards ones.
Yeah.
So you could have like Lamelo technically is a one, but is he the one guarding ones, or are you playing him next to Devontae Graham or Rozier or whoever? And yeah,
So
yeah.
like this is kind of like a good corollary to like our discussion about like value is instantaneous in college. But like, do you view value in the NBA? Like you said, these players like seem more valuable. Do you see that more as a function of like a lineup like resiliency, where like these players like regardless of the lineups around them are like they're not as context dependent. Like you can fit them like in a variety of different schemes, or are you saying that like they have a higher chance of reaching like outlier chance of like reaching that like primary initiator type role? Which of these
No,
do you
no.
think it is?
Well, the more the fit, but it's really neither. It's not necessarily that they have a
Oh,
higher chance or that they fit better. It's just the position that they play has a high, like
oh yeah, I
if
see.
you do reach the high offensive value, that offensive value is more valuable than reaching the same offensive value
At a
as a
different
point guard.
position. Oh, I see.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. Consider because of like all the considerations of like their height or their frame and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because they're able to
Okay.
fill the 3 or the 4 for you. Because you can't play Devontae Graham or I don't know Trey Young at the 3 or 4. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because they fit so many more positions. Okay.
Yeah,
Or
I
part
guess
of
you could
that.
say because yeah, part of it. Yeah, but it's
And
not
plus
necessarily that but it's just that
they're
they
yeah.
fit the 3 or the 4
The
if,
position itself is more valuable.
on
Is
the
that what you're
offensive.
saying?
Yeah, yeah, kind of on the
Okay.
offensive end. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just like if you had a point guard who's like able to get like Rudy Gobert defensive impact, if you could get that from your point guard possession, and then you could also get Rudy Gobert, because you know what I mean. If
yeah,
you already
yeah,
had a
yeah.
center who gets Rudy Gobert's defensive value, you can't get a Rudy Gobert and play him at the 4. He's not gonna have the same defensive value if he's playing at the 4,
Exactly.
right? Because
Yeah.
but if you have a point guard who gets Rudy Gobert's defensive value and then you add Rudy Gobert, then you could double them up because they're both getting, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
You could be
yeah.
like the GOAT defensive team. Hypothetically, it's not perfect, but just to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
explain the concept. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever like thought about it as like a position-based value system, but like that does hold like intuitive value.
Is projecting as like me on draft Twitter as a kind of amateur, as opposed to me projecting as if a team hired me. Like, do you have some ideas of difference for that? I have like just as working a little bit with the agencies and
Hmm.
even like consulting a little bit for some coaches. Um,
Yeah, what
like
would you say for that?
just I mean, the most obvious one is obviously like when you're going for a particular team or a particular even like agency, like you have to consider like the fit for them, and like for their particular future. And then from that, there's a lot of things like I mean, from an agency perspective, it's like, do you have any type of relationship with that player or anybody that knows that
Yeah,
player, like how you could get to them? For teams, obviously that's less so, but what would be another difference? Maybe location, for example, for a team, or they take like an older guy on, a guy who's more ready to contribute now. Like say you're like uh, you just went to the conference finals and you were like one
yeah,
shot away from beating the eventual champion. Now, if you could add like one wing, like this year, you might win the title already. Whereas if you're a team that's like kind of rebuilding stage, you probably wouldn't. You would probably just go swing for somebody who may even like not turn out to be anything, but has like some really high upside or something like that.
yeah. I don't know. I feel like I don't know if I'm strictly BPA best player available, but like just like the history of like win now teams trying to take like players who can contribute now, it's just not very like nice. Like just like that history. I just feel like generally speaking, just take the best. I don't think that fit is should be as much of as like as a consideration as some people make it out to be. Like I remember like when the Cavs drafted Darius Garland right after Colin Sexton, everyone's like, why did you just draft another like short guard who's supposed to play the exact same position as Sexton? And obviously in hindsight, like that was correct. That was the correct move. But like, I just feel like, especially when you're like a tanking team, like there should be no consideration of it. Even if you already have like a primary and you're trying to take like another guy who projects as a primary, like just take the player and you're just trying to maximize the value of your draft pick. That's like that kind of goes back to like the goal of like what is scouting, like what is the point of drafting in the first place? Like what's the point of how to even win? But I think you just accumulate assets. That's what you do at the end of the day. To win, projection is so nebulous that it's very, very difficult to like point to a niche, find a player, and say that guy fits my niche. I'm going to take him, and then they're actually being successful. And like I think that projection is so hard already, and then even projecting them to pigeonhole like into a certain niche such a young age, like so instantaneously, like there's so many different variables, and adding more and more variables to the equation just makes it even more and more like unlikely. So I think
Yeah.
that
Also, to add to
yeah,
your point, the roster turnover is insane nowadays. So like
exactly.
even like you're drafting for your team this year, and next year all those guys are gone. So it was
Yeah,
like
you literally go up like the Lakers were like had the number 2 pick like 3 years in a row, and like all of a sudden now they're like now I don't know about now, but like they're contenders all of a sudden once they sign LeBron. So like there's
right.
so much turnover, there's so much uncertainty that like just adding more variables that have inherent uncertainty, I don't think that's the right move. I just think that taking the player who projects to be the best player is just probably the best move. It kind of depends on your framework as well. Like I think that the Raptors or the Heat, they're very good at like developing shooting or like certain like micro skills that make those like undrafted free agents
That's
have.
good.
Yeah. So like if you're knowledgeable or cognizant of what your organization can develop, I think that it is smart to like find players who can fit that mold of prospects who are undervalued, but you can fix up a little bit. But like generally speaking, like I struggle to think of like a better like reductive draft strategy than simply saying like best player available, prospect that you think is the best. I won't.
Like sometimes people will say, "Oh, this guy busted because the fit, like he didn't fit well, and like if in another team he could have developed better." And Sean thinks like all of that is bullshit. Always, like it's
I
always just
kind
the way.
I think I kind of
Yeah,
fall in line with that.
yeah, like he's very like strong into that. But even with him, I convinced him like there's like some examples, and I think we talked about this last time a little bit. But like the example I remember me and Sean talked about is because it was that year with Sharif Cooper and Corey Kispert, and they were projected similar. And funnily enough, the team that I used as like I'm like, if you're the Hawks, would you really draft Sharif Cooper? Because
Yeah.
like they took him,
Yeah.
but yeah, like because at that point the Hawks needed more shooters and got like wings that could fit around Trey Young, and I was like, provided maybe you hate Corey Kispert or you love Trey Young, but provided you have him approximately similar, even if you have Cooper maybe a little bit higher in the vacuum because of that upside, but
Yeah.
if you already have Trey Young, you're not gonna need like a guy that upside of Cooper is not that useful to you because you already have that point guard that you're gonna is kind of your heliocentric son or whatever you want to call it, and yeah, perhaps Kispert would be the better choice, even if you think Cooper is a slightly better prospect. So in the cases like that, I think there you could come up with like examples like that where fit overcomes best player.
Yeah, but like there's so like I mentioned this earlier in the episode, but like there's so many players who like had garnered such high usage as like prospects in college, and then when they go to the league, they fit into these smaller niches, like using the micro skills that they had like in that structure of like being like the primary in college. But like even with Sharif, like he has his own like shortcomings or whatever. But like I think that just like if you see a player who's succeeding in like high usage, and just because you have Trey Young doesn't mean you just pass on him because you think they're gonna clash. I think like you just take that player if you have enough conviction in Sharif Cooper. I think that like you don't need to say that he doesn't fit next to Trey Young. I'm not gonna take him. I just think that you just take the best player available and then just see what like just fit the component parts together. I don't know if what your thought on that was.
I don't totally agree because I do think like Sharif Cooper, somebody like that, especially, would definitely need like a be given like opportunity to be able to make the best of their skill set. Like you can't bring
Yeah.
Sharif Cooper off the bench for 10 minutes a game. I think this is a theory I have that kind of actually some of the analytical research I've seen kind of doesn't agree with this, but
Oh,
there's
really?
no like there's no conclusive evidence for it either way yet. So I stand by that coming off the bench, especially for like small like perimeter players that require like rhythm to get to, they want to get into rhythm and like play like that. For a lot of those guys, I mean, there's certain exceptions always, but for a lot of those guys, like coming off the bench kind of hurts their value, like even on the per minute, even if you adjust the per possession per
Yeah,
minute,
yeah, no, no,
whatever.
that's true.
Yeah,
That's true.
because they're not able to get into rhythm. They're not as comfortable, just playing for a few minutes at a time and stuff like that. So I think for somebody like Sharif, you would preferably would have wanted him on the team that would give him, maybe not start him right away or something like that, but
No,
at
yeah,
least
yeah.
give him some opportunities,
But
or Malik
yeah,
Monk is an example of that. Oh yeah, go on. Sorry.
I feel like that's just like simply like you can kind of just narrow the archetype down to just like undersized guards. Like just like generally undersized guards, like they need to be generating because they're like such like negatives on the defensive end and like they because of like all of like the defensive considerations. I feel like if you have a guard who isn't like gonna be the primary and he's like short or like undersized or whatever and like can't defend or stuff like that, like those players, if they're not in that primary role, they just inherently just they lose so much of their value. Like Trey Burke, like if he's not going to be that primary like player, Trey Burke is not a valuable NBA player. Like I don't no disrespect to Trey Burke, but it's just not how the current NBA can function with a 6 foot guard coming off the bench. It's just not like once IT wasn't like the primary guy in Boston, he kind of fell out of the league so quickly. So I think that like though that argument Sharif versus Kispert that's kind of like a very like an exception just because Sharif does fill that like that niche archetype where these players either have to be primaries or they don't end up being valuable NBA players. I think if you do choose a different type of archetype or type of like non undersized guards, I think that would be a lot more intense discussion where like BPA would be generally be the right answer or not right answer, but like preferred answer.
Well, you could also
But
say
yeah.
for like, I guess you could say they're undersized guards also, but like somebody like Malik Monk or I don't know, Buddy Hield, if he had come off the bench and not gotten when he was even his rookie year, in fact, when he was coming off the bench and not really getting a lot of opportunity on Pelicans, he was horrible. And then the Kings
Yeah.
started using him more because guys like that depend a lot on shooting and getting into rhythm and being comfortable, confident with taking shots. A lot of putting up a lot of shots, they kind of need playing time and the opportunity also. But yeah, I guess to some extent they're undersized guards in
Yeah.
their own way.
But
But
like
yeah,
Heald was like intuitively scalable, right? Like he was like one of the best shooting seasons of all time in like 2016. So like him versus like the issue like with Sharif, you're like, I don't know if he can play this off ball role and he'll bleed defensive value. But like with Heald, like even though he isn't that level of like star equity, he's still like very, very projectable to the point that you could even before the draft, you could like pretty much like slot him in as like some off ball shooting like demon, which I don't know if like that archetype like you can have more debates about like Healed rather than Sharif. I feel like
no, I'm not. But I'm saying like Hield is also like Sharif in that like if he had played for a team that already had like you're right that there's like wings are more kind of right now people want
yeah,
wings all the time, so it's like easier to find the spot for Hield in general. But if you were a team that already had a ton of wings and Hield was coming off the bench, I think he wouldn't be the player he is, because like the reason Hield is good is because he shoots like what 40% or whatever, 30, I don't know, percent from
yeah,
three on a ton of attempts. But if he didn't get all those attempts, uh, he would. I mean, if he even if he got all those attempts per minute, but if he didn't shoot that high percentage on that volume, he would be pretty much useless. And I mean, if he shot like 31% on those attempts per game,
no, yeah, that's true.
he would be like useless. And I think if he was coming off the bench and only playing in small spurts at a time, it's arguable if he would have been as good of a shooter in the league if he would have had that confidence and that comfort at making that type of percentage at those type of shots.
I guess that's also like a developmental like philosophy, right? Like if he was good enough to shoot, like would he get those opportunities, or like is he not getting those opportunities because he's not getting he's not good enough to shoot in the first
Yeah,
place.
it's always a chicken
Like,
and egg situation either way.
yeah,
Like
exactly.
you're always saying like, what if, we can't go back in time, obviously.
Like, I think like I would probably fall into the boat like general like the heuristic I would use is if a player isn't playing as much, they're not good enough. They're not good enough to receive those minutes. I'll look the Alonzo Ball, like what are those people on Twitter? They're like, oh, give Alonzo the ball more, but he doesn't have the skill thresholds to even receive like to get those on ball reps in the first place. So I think that like simply stating that a player is not getting on ball reps or like minutes because it's just like some issue with the coaching or some like team structure issue. Like maybe that could be the case in certain cases, but generally speaking, I would be more like inclined to believe that a player is not getting minutes because they're not good enough to receive those minutes, even if there
Uh,
are might be, I don't know, like for
yeah,
like specific
sometimes.
skill, yeah, like skill
I
stuff like
think
shooting, like on ball reps for passers or whatever.
no, in general, you're probably right, but I do think
Yeah.
like sometimes people also go the wrong way there, where they're like, "Oh, he's not playing. You don't know shit. Like the coaches know so much more than you. They work in the league." It's like coaches are wrong all the time too. I'm
Oh
not
yeah,
saying
no.
I'm smarter than every NBA coach or anything, but like some coaches do dumb shit, make dumb decisions all the time too. Like that doesn't mean necessarily anything. Like they could definitely be wrong. Is all I'm saying. But
Yeah,
in general, yeah,
yeah.
in general, you're right. That probably minutes have a decent correlation to how good a player actually is.
And there's like a decent like sample size aspect of it. Like obviously you don't make that judgment after one season, but like if this guy's playing like seven, like Lonzo played what, like 6 seasons, like if you've played a decent number of seasons and you're still not receiving those minutes, like if you've been in a number of different environments, number of different like team ecosystems, and you're still not receiving like what you projected them to like get at their pre-draft evaluation, I think it's the right move, the morally right thing to do to say like, oh, my evaluation wasn't correct, rather than simply blaming it on system, even though the system has been so variable like, over and over again.
But I'll say this though, like if a play, as long as like say a player plays like a decent like 800 1,000 minutes in the season, like it's not a tiny sample, it's still enough.
Oh yeah, yeah,
If their stats like across the board, like they're higher, like points, rebounds, assists, or like BPM, RPM are all better than the guy that's starting over them and playing more minutes, there's a good chance that coach doesn't know what the fuck they're
oh
doing
yeah,
in
yeah,
that
yeah.
case.
Yeah, production adjusted like sample size, yeah, but like
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I agree. I
Yeah,
don't think
in
it's
those
like
type of
yeah,
cases, like I would say statistics are more correct than the coaches more than 50% of the time. Not like 100 by far. There's definitely cases where the coach, even if the statistics say otherwise, coach has a good point because there's something the
yeah,
statistics are missing. There's definitely those chances too, what is it called? Not chances, like cases too. But yeah, it's I would say statistics are probably more than 50% correct in those cases. But yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
overall, yeah,
Yeah, I agree with that. Like if you're getting enough, it's I was more about your point about like a player not getting in like a rhythm or something like that because they're not getting enough minutes. But like if you're playing like enough minutes and you play like 800 minutes the entire season, you haven't been in rhythm the whole season. Like at that point,
yeah,
like
okay, yeah. The important part there is because playing in small chunks of minutes. So only 3 4 minutes. That and also when you're a bench player, you always feel like you're gonna get pulled, like you're gonna miss
that's
or
true.
you're
Yeah,
gonna
the
miss.
psychology of it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So those types of things I think do matter and are important to note. So like a starter, they get like 8 9 minutes, they might miss three threes in a row, and it's so what, they're gonna come out at the 3 minute mark, get back at the 8 minute mark of the second quarter or whatever it is, and and then play another 8 minutes, and they'll start feeling it and so forth. Whereas a bench player, they're like, oh, should I take this shot? What if I miss and he pulls me? And then like,
Oh yeah,
oh,
yeah,
they
yeah, that's
miss
true.
one and they get pulled. They're sitting on the bench again, and they get cold. They're not as comfortable. Like I do think those things matter. To what
So
degree, I'm
yeah,
not sure. It's hard to say. It's definitely a chicken and egg situation. Like, are they playing? You're right. Are they not playing a lot because they suck, or are they not playing a lot? Because they're just for whatever other reason. But yeah,
yeah. I feel like I don't know, like those type of players don't tend to be the most valuable players. That makes sense. Like if you're missing on these sort of players, like if this player is a bench player and they're not getting to rhythm, like after all of the sample size, like maybe like yeah, it's just like a situational ecosystem thing where they're not in the right situation. But like if they're not able to generate enough value despite in that situation, I would I would assume that like even if they were in like the most valuable situation or most beneficial situation, their value wouldn't be as much. Like if you're like truly a good player, like a star level all-star player, like I do think that like regardless of like all like landing spot, you are gonna make some sort of impact. So that is again, I said the word like 3 times this podcast, like developmental determinism. Like there is an aspect of like landing spot like cushion where despite the landing spot, you're gonna end up being a good player. But I do agree with you, like there are so many different nuances and stuff like that where like you don't get in a rhythm, you're a little scared, like a coach pulls you, like all that stuff. But overall, I do think that is like somewhat negligible if you're especially
Yeah,
if you're talking
even
about like high level drop picks.
even